The docking bay of Nexus Prime hummed with activity as the sleek Thylorian cruiser, Sovereign's Edge, extended its boarding ramp. Princess Kailara Zethmori emerged first, her crystalline blue skin catching the station's artificial light like polished sapphire. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with elegant limbs and features that seemed carved from precious stone, she embodied the ethereal beauty her species was renowned for across the galaxy. Her ornate ceremonial armor gleamed with embedded gems that pulsed with her heartbeat, and the flowing cape behind her seemed to defy gravity itself. Behind her walked 6 members of her elite guard, each nearly as tall and imposing as their princess. Their presence commanded immediate attention from every species represented on the station, except for one. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison stood at parade rest near the equipment staging area, his attention focused on a datapad displaying tactical readouts. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and calloused hands, he represented everything the Thylorian Empire considered primitive about humanity. His standard-issue combat fatigues were practical rather than ornate, his equipment functional rather than beautiful. When he finally looked up at the arriving delegation, his expression remained professionally neutral. Kailara's violet eyes swept the bay dismissively until they settled on the human soldier. She whispered something to her aide in flowing Thylorian, and both laughed, a sound like crystal chimes that somehow managed to convey mockery. "You there?" Kailara called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been denied. "Human soldier." Jake set down his datapad and approached, offering a respectful nod. "Your Highness, Staff Sergeant Morrison, 3rd Tactical Division." The princess circled him slowly, as if examining a curious specimen. Her guards watched with barely concealed amusement. "How quaint. Tell me, Sergeant Morrison, is this truly the best your species can offer for these exercises? You appear so—" She gestured vaguely with one elegant hand. "Compact." "I'm here to do my job, Your Highness." "And what exactly is your job?" She picked up his sidearm from the equipment table, handling it like it might contaminate her. "Defending yourself with these crude projectile weapons? How wonderfully primitive." Jake's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Sometimes the simplest tools are the most effective." This drew another laugh from her entourage. "Simplest? Yes. Your entire species seems devoted to simplicity." She set down his weapon with obvious distaste. "Your ships rely on crude chemical propulsion. Your soldiers carry basic kinetic weapons, and your tactics—" She waved dismissively. "Well, I suppose when one lacks the intellectual capacity for sophisticated warfare, one must make do with brute force." Several human personnel in the bay had stopped their work to listen, their faces reddening with suppressed anger. But Jake simply picked up his sidearm and holstered it with practiced efficiency. "Is there something specific you need, Your Highness, or are you just here to critique our equipment?" The casual response clearly caught Kailara off guard. In her experience, lesser beings either cowered or raged when confronted with Thylorian superiority. This human did neither. "I am here," she said, drawing herself to her full, imposing height, "to observe what promises to be a most educational experience. My people have agreed to these joint exercises out of diplomatic necessity, but I suspect we'll learn more about human limitations than human capabilities." "That's possible," Jake agreed calmly. "Though I've found that assumptions tend to be dangerous in my line of work." Before Kailara could respond, the station's intercom crackled to life. "All exercise participants report to Briefing Bay 7. Joint tactical planning session begins in 10 minutes. As the various species began moving toward the briefing area, Kailara swept past Jake with her entourage in tow. "Do try to keep up, Sergeant. I'm curious to see how humans handle strategic thinking." The briefing room buzzed with controlled tension, as representatives from 6 different species took their positions around the holographic display table. Admiral Vorthak, a massive reptilian Krugan, presented the exercise parameters while various tactical scenarios rotated in the air above them. Kailara listened with half attention, already convinced of the outcome. Her people had never lost a military engagement. Their technology was centuries ahead of most species, and their tactical doctrine was studied in military academies across 3 sectors. When Admiral Vorthak called for tactical input on the first scenario, a three-way siege situation, Kalara's aide, Commander Thexlia, immediately began outlining an elegant solution involving orbital bombardment and synchronized assault patterns. Effective, the Admiral rumbled approvingly. Any other approaches? Jake spoke up from his position near the back. The bombardment pattern assumes the enemy won't adapt their shielding frequency. If they do, your assault teams will be exposed for approximately 4 minutes during the shield reset cycle. The room fell silent. Thexilia's crystalline features darkened. The probability of shield adaptation is less than 12% based on their demonstrated technology, unless they're using captured Thylorian equipment, Jake replied evenly. Which intelligence suggests they are? He stepped forward and manipulated the hologram, showing how the enemy could exploit the exact weakness he'd identified. A diversionary assault from this vector would force them to reveal their true capabilities before committing your main force. Admiral Vorthak studied the modified display with obvious interest. Several other species representatives nodded approvingly. Even the Thylorian guards exchanged glances of grudging respect. Kalara, however, felt something she rarely experienced: doubt. The human's observation was not only valid, but displayed the kind of strategic thinking she'd assumed his species incapable of. Worse, he'd identified a flaw in Thylorian doctrine that could have cost lives. Interesting, she said coolly, though her pulse quickened in a way that had nothing to do with anger. For a primitive species, you show unexpected cunning. Jake met her gaze directly, and for the first time, Kalara saw something in his brown eyes that unsettled her, not fear or deference but evaluation. He was studying her the same way she had studied him, and somehow she had the uncomfortable feeling she might be found wanting. "Thank you, Your Highness," he said simply, and turned back to the tactical display. As the briefing continued, Kalara found herself watching the human soldier more carefully than she cared to admit. The live combat simulation was meant to be the crown jewel of the joint exercises, a carefully controlled demonstration of each species' combat capabilities against holographic enemies in a secured arena. Princess Kalara watched from the observation deck with other dignitaries, her earlier irritation with the human sergeant temporarily forgotten as she anticipated watching Thylorian superiority on full display. The arena floor buzzed with activity as mixed teams took their positions. Jake's squad occupied the eastern quadrant, their movements efficient and coordinated despite their primitive equipment. Kalara found herself watching him more than she cared to admit, noting how the other humans instinctively looked to him for guidance despite several officers outranking him. "Beginning simulation in 30 seconds, announced the control room. "All teams prepare for—" The announcement cut off abruptly as emergency klaxons began wailing throughout the station. Red warning lights bathed everything in crimson, and the arena's containment barriers flickered ominously. "This is not part of the exercise," Admiral Vorthak's voice boomed over the communication system. "All personnel maintain positions while we investigate." The explosion that rocked the station's lower levels cut him off. Through the observation deck's reinforced windows, Kalara could see smoke billowing from the creature containment sector. Her blood ran cold as she realized what that meant. "The Ravenclaw," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the alarms. Commander Thexlia appeared at her side, his usually composed features tight with concern. "Your Highness, we must evacuate immediately. The beast's containment has been compromised." Kalara's mind reeled. The Thylorian Ravenclaw was their most prized war beast, a 9-foot-tall apex predator with razor-sharp talons, armored hide that could deflect energy weapons, and predatory intelligence that made it nearly unstoppable. It had been brought for demonstration purposes only, sedated and secured in what should have been an impenetrable containment cell. The observation deck shuddered as something massive struck it from below. Through the transparasteel floor, Kalara saw the Ravenclaw tear through the arena's lower access tunnel, its 6 legs moving with terrifying grace. The creature's serpentine neck swiveled as it tested the air with a forked tongue, and when it opened its maw, rows of crystalline teeth gleamed like deadly gems. Panic erupted throughout the arena. Most teams immediately broke formation, scrambling for exits that were automatically sealing under emergency protocols. The Thylorian Honor Guard, supposedly the elite of their military, stood frozen in terror. They had never faced their own war beast without control collars and neural inhibitors. The observation deck. Kalara felt her legs give out as primal fear overwhelmed her. She had grown up hearing stories of the Ravenclaw's hunting prowess, of how a single beast could devastate an entire enemy battalion. Never in her pampered life had she faced genuine mortal danger. The control protocols, Thexelia stammered, fumbling with his communicator. Why aren't the neural commands working? Below them, the Ravenclaw had locked onto the scent of prey. Its head turned toward a group of terrified Zentorian diplomats cowering behind an overturned barrier. The beast's throat sac began to glow, the telltale sign it was preparing to unleash its plasma breath. That's when Jake moved. While everyone else fled or froze, the human sergeant calmly assessed the situation. Kalara watched in fascination as he grabbed 2 damaged energy cells from a destroyed training drone and a length of fiber optic cable from the arena's sensor array. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, jury-rigging something that shouldn't have been possible with those components. The Ravenclaw lunged toward the Zentorians, but Jake was already in motion. He sprinted across the arena floor, not away from the beast but toward it, sliding beneath its plasma breath at the last second. The improvised device in his hands sparked to life. Somehow he had created a neural disruptor using nothing but salvaged parts. The beast whirled toward this new threat, confused by prey that dared to attack rather than flee. Jake rolled aside as massive talons gouged the metal floor where he'd been standing, then came up behind the creature's front left leg. Without hesitation, he pressed his makeshift weapon against the beast's neural cluster, a spot that should have been impossible for an outsider to know about. The Ravenclaw convulsed as conflicting neural signals overloaded its nervous system. Jake held on as the creature thrashed, his face grim with concentration. For a moment that stretched like eternity, human determination battled alien fury. Then the beast collapsed, its system shutting down into protective hibernation. The arena fell silent except for the distant wail of alarms. Jake stood slowly, tossing aside his improvised weapon as if subduing a war beast was just another day's work. He looked around the arena, checking for injuries among the scattered personnel, his gaze lingering on the observation deck where Kalara sat trembling. Their eyes met through the transparisteel, and for the first time in her life, Princess Kalara Zethmori felt truly small. Not physically, she would always tower over the human sergeant, but in every way that mattered. While she had cowered in terror, this primitive being had calmly risked his life to save everyone, including her. Jake gave her the same professional nod he'd offered during their first meeting, then turned to help the injured Zentorians to safety. He didn't seek recognition, didn't gloat, didn't even seem to consider what he'd done particularly remarkable. As emergency crews flooded the arena and medical teams tended to the wounded, Kalara remained frozen in place, her entire worldview cracking like ice in spring. Everything she had been taught about human inferiority, about the natural order of species, about her own inherent superiority, all of it lay in ruins around her feet. And somehow, she had never been more attracted to anyone in her life. The medical bay hummed with activity as casualties from the Ravenclaw incident received treatment. Kalara sat on a biobed, her legs still unsteady from shock, while a Zentorian medic treated the minor cuts she'd sustained when diving for cover. The physical wounds were insignificant. The damage to her pride was catastrophic. "Your Highness." Commander Thexelia approached with obvious reluctance. "The initial investigation suggests sabotage. Someone deliberately compromised the containment protocols." Kalara barely heard him. Her attention was fixed on Jake, who sat across the medical bay having his forearm bandaged where the Ravenclaw's claws had grazed him. He caught her staring and offered a polite nod before returning his attention to the medic's work. "How?" she whispered, more to herself than to her aide. "The security footage shows—" "No," Kalara interrupted. "How did he know where to strike? The beast? How did he build a neural disruptor from scrap metal? How did he move without fear when trained warriors froze? Thexlia followed her gaze and his expression soured. Perhaps the humans have encountered similar creatures before, or perhaps it was simply luck. But Kalara knew it wasn't luck. She had seen the calculation in Jake's eyes, the way he'd assessed the situation and acted with precision born of experience and intelligence. Everything she'd been taught about human limitations was proving false, and it terrified her in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. The station's lockdown protocols had been activated pending the investigation, trapping all exercise, participants aboard Nexus Prime. Kalara found herself with something she'd never experienced before, time to observe without the pressure of diplomatic duties or royal expectations. She watched Jake over the following days, studying him the way she might study a fascinating puzzle. He moved through the station with quiet confidence, checking on injured personnel regardless of their species, offering tactical advice to the security teams hunting for the saboteur, and treating everyone with the same professional respect he'd shown her. It was maddening. On the third day of lockdown, she found herself in the station's observation lounge, staring out at the stars and wrestling with thoughts she didn't understand. The vast viewport showed the swirling colors of the Nexus Nebula, beautiful and alien against the infinite black. Couldn't sleep either. She turned to find Jake approaching with 2 cups of what smelled like Terran coffee. He offered her one, which she accepted automatically. "I don't require as much rest as humans," she said, falling back on familiar superiority, but the words felt hollow now. "Neither do I, apparently." He settled into a chair beside her, careful to maintain respectful distance. "Mind if I ask what you're thinking about?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked what she was thinking as a princess. Her thoughts were assumed to be state secrets or beyond the comprehension of lesser beings. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that I may have been wrong about some things." Jake sipped his coffee, waiting for her to continue. When she didn't, he said, "That's not necessarily a bad thing. Being wrong means there's room to learn." Easy for you to say. You weren't raised believing your entire species was destined to rule the galaxy. "No," Jake agreed. "I was raised believing every person has worth, regardless of where they come from or what they look like." The simple statement hit Kalara like a physical blow. She studied his profile in the nebula's light, the strong jaw, the weathered hands, the scars that spoke of battles fought and won. Nothing about him suggested the weakness she'd been taught to see in humans. "Your arm," she said suddenly. "Let me see it." Jake looked puzzled but rolled up his sleeve, revealing the bandaged gouges from the Ravenclaw's claws. Without thinking, Kalara reached out and gently unwrapped the dressing. Her fingers, naturally cool due to her physiology, traced the edges of the healing wounds. "These should have been deeper," she murmured, her medical training taking over. "The beast's claws are designed to shred armor. I got lucky." "No." Her fingers stilled on his skin. "You knew exactly how to move. You fought creatures like this before." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Not exactly like this. But I've learned that predators, no matter how alien, follow certain patterns. The trick is reading those patterns faster than they can adapt." Kalara found herself leaning closer, drawn by the warmth radiating from his skin. Thylorians ran cooler than humans, and his body heat was strangely comforting. "You could have died," she said softly. "So could everyone else. That was unacceptable." The matter-of-fact way he said it, as if risking his life for others was the most natural thing in the universe, stirred something deep in Kalara's chest. She had been surrounded by beings who served her out of duty or fear, but here was someone who served others out of choice. Her fingers were still resting on his arm, and she became acutely aware of the contact. Jake's skin was surprisingly soft, despite the scars, and she could feel his pulse beneath her fingertips, steady and strong. "Your Highness," Jake said quietly, and she realized she had been staring at him. "Kalara," she corrected impulsively. "When we're alone, just..." "Kalara." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Kalara," he repeated, and her name sounded different in his rough voice. intimate in a way that made her pulse quicken. She should pull her hand away, should maintain the distance that propriety demanded, should remember that he was beneath her station and her species. Instead, she found herself leaning closer. "I owe you my life," she whispered. "You don't owe me anything." "Then what do you want from me?" Jake's brown eyes searched hers, and for a moment she thought he might close the remaining distance between them. Then he gently covered her hand with his own, warm and calloused against her smooth skin. "I want you to see that strength isn't about what species you're born into," he said quietly. "It's about what you choose to do when it matters." The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to voice. Kalara felt her carefully constructed worldview crumbling further, replaced by something new and terrifying and wonderful. She was falling for a human, and for the first time in her privileged life she didn't care about the consequences. The saboteur struck again on the 5th night of lockdown. Emergency klaxons shrieked through Nexus Prime as someone triggered an overload in the station's power core. The lights flickered and died, plunging most sectors into darkness as backup systems struggled to compensate. In the chaos, life support began failing on several decks. Kalara found herself trapped in a maintenance corridor with Jake when the blast doors sealed, cutting them off from the main evacuation routes. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as they felt their way through the narrow passage, searching for an alternate path to the emergency shelters. "The thermal regulation system is offline," Kalara observed, her breath already visible in the rapidly cooling air. "We have perhaps 2 hours before hypothermia becomes a factor." Jake examined his portable scanner, its screen providing their only real illumination. "There's a service junction about 50 meters ahead. If we can access the emergency power conduits from there, we might be able to restore life support to this section." They worked in silence, their earlier emotional intimacy replaced by professional focus. But Kalara found herself acutely aware of Jake's presence beside her, the steady sound of his breathing, the way he moved with unconscious grace despite the cramped conditions, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him even as the temperature dropped. The service junction was a tight space barely large enough for both of them. Jake squeezed through the access panel first, then helped Kalara through, his hand strong and sure on her waist. The contact sent electricity through her that had nothing to do with the station's power problems. "I need to reroute the emergency circuits," Jake explained, his voice echoing in the confined space. "But someone has to monitor the power flow from the other side to make sure we don't trigger another overload." It was dangerous work. One mistake could electrocute either of them or cause an explosion that would rupture the hull. But they had no choice. Without life support, dozens of people in this section would die. As Jake worked with the power conduits, Kalara found herself watching his hands move with practiced precision. Everything about him spoke of competence and control, so different from the pampered nobles she'd grown up around. "Jake," she said quietly, needing to break the tension-filled silence. "Earlier, in the observation lounge, why did you pull away?" His hands stilled on the conduits. "You know why." "Pretend I don't." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because you're a princess, and I'm a soldier. Because our species have been enemies more often than allies. Because getting involved with you could start a diplomatic incident that gets people killed. And if none of that mattered?" This time his pause was shorter. "Then I'd have kissed you 3 days ago." The admission hung between them in the dark, charged with possibility. Kalara felt her pulse quicken, her skin warming despite the cold. "What if I told you," she said carefully, "that I've never been kissed by someone who saw me as anything other than a political asset?" Jake's laugh was soft and bitter. "Then I'd say your people are even bigger fools than I thought." The power conduits sparked to life under his hands and emergency lighting flickered on throughout their section. But neither of them moved to leave the cramped junction. "The first time I saw you," Kalara confessed, "I thought you were everything wrong with humanity. Crude, simple, beneath my notice. And now I think you might be everything right with it." Jake turned to face her in the narrow space, bringing them close enough that she could feel his breath on her skin. His eyes searched her face in the dim light. "Kalara," he said quietly, "what are we doing?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I've never done anything like this before." "Neither have I." The confession surprised her. "Never?" "Never with someone who matters this much." The words broke something inside her, some last barrier she'd been maintaining. When Jake reached up to cup her face in his hands, she didn't pull away. When he leaned closer, she met him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. But when Kalara's lips parted under his, when she made a soft sound of need against his mouth, gentleness gave way to hunger. Jake's arms came around her, pulling her against him in the confined space. Kalara had never realized how perfectly she could fit against someone smaller than herself, how right it could feel to be held by hands that trembled slightly with restrained passion. Her own hands fisted in his shirt, anchoring herself as the kiss deepened. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jake rested his forehead against hers, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "This is insane," he murmured. "Completely," she agreed, then kissed him again. This time there was nothing tentative about it. Days of tension and denial poured out in desperate touches and hungry mouths. Kalara had been kissed before, but never like this. Never with such raw need, such perfect understanding of what she needed before she knew it herself. Jake's lips found the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder, and Kalara arched against him with a gasp. The sound seemed to inflame him further. His hands tangled in her hair, tugging gently until she looked at him. "I need you to be sure," he said roughly. "Because once we cross this line, I won't be able to pretend I don't care about you." In answer, she pulled his mouth back to hers, pouring all her confusion and desire and growing love into the kiss. When she finally pulled back, her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "I've been pretending not to care about you since the moment we met," she said. "I'm tired of pretending." Jake's smile was soft and wondering, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. "Your Highness." "Kalara," she corrected firmly. "Just Kalara." "Kalara," he repeated, and kissed her again, softer this time but no less meaningful. Around them, the station's systems hummed back to life, but neither noticed. They had found something far more important than safety in each other's arms. They had found the courage to let their walls finally come down. The message arrived 3 days later, transmitted on an encrypted Thylorian frequency that made every alien on the station step back in deference. High Admiral Zethkar, Kalara's own father, appeared as a towering hologram in the station's main conference room, his crystalline features set in lines of cold fury. "Princess Kalara," his voice echoed with the authority of absolute power. "You will return to Thylos Prime immediately. Your association with the human has been noted and will be addressed." Kalara stood before the transmission with her spine straight and her chin raised, every inch the royal princess she'd been trained to be. But Jake could see the tremor in her hands, the way her jaw tightened at her father's tone. "I am conducting important diplomatic work here, Father. The joint exercises have yielded valuable intelligence about our allies' capabilities. The exercises are concluded. Your ship departs in 6 hours." The Admiral's violet eyes, so like his daughter's, fixed on a point beyond the transmission's range. "Sergeant Morrison, step forward." Jake moved into the hologram's line of sight, his expression carefully neutral. He'd known this moment would come, had been dreading it since he'd first kissed Kalara in that maintenance junction. "Your reputation precedes you," the Admiral continued. "The human who defeated a Ravenclaw with improvised tools. Impressive. It would be unfortunate if such talents were lost due to poor judgment." The threat was delicately phrased but unmistakable. Jake felt Kalara stiffen beside him. "Father." Silence. The Admiral's attention returned to his daughter. "You have 6 hours to prepare for departure. Do not test me on this, Kalara. The consequences would extend far beyond your personal preferences. The transmission ended, leaving them in heavy silence. Around the conference room, other species representatives found excuses to leave quickly, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire of Thylorian politics. When they were alone, Kalara turned to Jake with anguish in her eyes. "He'll have you killed," she whispered. Not openly, not in a way that could be traced back to him, but I know. Jake's voice was steady, resigned. "It's all right." "No, it's not all right." Her composure cracked, and for the first time since he'd known her, Kalara looked young and vulnerable. "I won't let him hurt you because of my choices." Jake reached for her hands, marveling at how they fit so perfectly in his despite the difference in their sizes. "Then make a different choice. Go home. Be the princess your people need you to be." "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. Your people will survive without their precious princess for a while longer." Her voice grew stronger, more determined. "Jake, look at me." He met her eyes, seeing the steel beneath the vulnerability. "I love you," she said simply. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I love you. And I'm not walking away from that because my father thinks humans are beneath our notice." The words hit Jake like a plasma bolt to the chest. He'd hoped, had begun to believe that what was growing between them might be real, but hearing her say it out loud changed everything. "Kalara, I love your courage, your competence, the way you see everyone as worthy of protection. I love how you never back down from what's right, even when it costs you. I love that you saved my life without expecting anything in return, and that you're willing to give up your life now to protect mine." She stepped closer, her hands framing his face the way he'd done to her in the maintenance junction. "But most of all, I love that you see me, not the princess, not the political asset, just me. And if loving you means giving up my title and my people's approval, then so be it." Jake stared at her, searching for any sign of doubt or second thoughts. Instead, he saw only determination and something that took his breath away. Complete trust. "You could lose everything," he said quietly. "I've already lost everything that doesn't matter. I won't lose what does." Instead of answering with words, Jake kissed her. This time there was no hesitancy, no holding back. This was goodbye and hello and forever all wrapped into one desperate moment of connection. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Jake rested his forehead against hers, his thumb tracing the elegant line of her cheekbone. "I love you, too," he said quietly. "More than I thought possible." Kalara's smile was radiant. "Then we face whatever comes next together." 6 hours later, Princess Kalara Zethmori stood on the bridge of the Thylorian cruiser Sovereign's Edge as it prepared to depart Nexus Prime. But she was not alone. Jake stood beside her in borrowed civilian clothes, having officially resigned, his commission to accept a position as her personal security consultant. Commander Thexelia approached with obvious reluctance. "Your Highness, your father's response to your message was colorful. He demands you return alone or face formal charges of treason." Kalara's hand found Jake's, their fingers intertwining. "Then inform the High Admiral that his daughter chooses love over politics. If that makes me a traitor to the Empire, so be it. The crew won't follow you in open rebellion against the throne. Then they're free to return to Thylus Prime and explain to my father how they lost his daughter to the big scary humans." Her voice carried new authority, not the inherited power of royalty, but the earned strength of someone who had chosen their own path. Anyone who stays does so by choice, not command. To everyone's surprise, most of the crew stayed. Word of the princess who had defied the Empire for love spread quickly through the ranks, and many found themselves inspired by her courage. 6 months later, Kalara and Jake stood together on the observation deck of a joint research station, watching their combined human Thalorian crew work side by side on projects that would have been impossible under the old regime. She had indeed lost her title and her inheritance, but had gained something far more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. "Any regrets?" Jake asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the stars. Kalara, leaned into his warmth, marveling at how natural it felt after all this time. Only that it took a war beast nearly killing me to realize what an idiot I was being. Jake's laugh rumbled through his chest. Well, when you put it that way. She turned in his arms, studying the face that had become more precious to her than any crown or title. Ask me again in 50 years. Is that a proposal, Your Former Highness? Maybe, she said, then kissed him before he could respond. Some questions, after all, were better answered with actions than words. Around them, the universe continued its ancient dance of stars and planets and possibilities. But for two beings who had learned that love could indeed transcend the boundaries of species and politics, the only thing that mattered was the warmth they had found in each other's arms.